Imagine this. It's 122 degrees outside. The asphalt is starting to soften. Air conditioners are running at full blast. The power grid is beginning to buckle. Going outside in the middle of the day is becoming dangerous. So humanity does what humanity usually does when things get too hot up here. We go down, not into the subway, all the way to the bottom of the ocean, an entire city underwater, homes, farms, hospitals, schools. You open the blinds, and instead of staring at a parking lot, there's a shark outside quietly judging your mortgage. Sounds like science fiction, but here's the weird part. From a physics standpoint, the idea isn't as insane as it sounds. Below the ocean's warm, well-mixed surface layer, you reach the thermocline, where temperatures drop. Deeper water is usually much colder and more stable than the surface. So while cities above are getting hammered by extreme heat, the ocean can start to look like one enormous natural heat shield. And that leads to a completely ridiculous thought. What if humanity's future isn't on Mars, but a few hundred feet beneath our own feet? But before you start shopping for an underwater apartment, there's one tiny problem. The ocean is trying to crush you, constantly. For roughly every 33 feet you descend, the pressure increases by about 1 atmosphere. So at around 330 feet deep, the pressure outside is roughly 11 atmospheres absolute. If you keep the inside of your city at normal surface pressure, basically like your house, the walls have to hold back a pressure difference of about 10 atmospheres. That works out to more than 10 tons of force pressing against every single square foot of the structure, 1 square foot. Now imagine something bigger than a tiny submarine. Imagine a shopping mall, a hospital, a school gym, a massive panoramic bedroom window, and suddenly it becomes obvious why a real underwater city probably wouldn't look like one giant glass bubble from a sci-fi movie. It would more likely be a network of thick cylinders, spheres, and smaller connected modules, because the ocean does not care about your architecture. But there is a trick. You can stop fighting the pressure. Instead of keeping the inside at a normal 1 atmosphere, you can raise the internal pressure until it's much closer to the surrounding water. Now the walls don't have to resist such a ridiculous pressure difference. And here's the interesting part. We've already done this. Back in 1962, Jacques Cousteau sent 2 men to live on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea, not for a couple of hours, for an entire week. Their home was called Con Shelf 1. Basically, it was a metal can about the size of a small van. But it worked, so Cousteau did what humans usually do after a successful dangerous experiment. He built a bigger one. Con Shelf 2 looked much more like an actual tiny underwater village. There were living quarters, a workshop, other structures. People worked underwater for weeks at a time. And almost simultaneously, the US Navy launched its own program, Sea Lab. In 1965, people were living roughly 200 feet underwater, and astronaut Scott Carpenter spent 30 straight days down there. So humanity proved that people could live on the seafloor more than 60 years ago, which raises an obvious question. If we could do this back when black and white TVs were still normal, where are our underwater cities? The answer is pretty unpleasant, because solving the pressure problem doesn't mean you've solved the human problem. If you live under elevated pressure for long enough, your body tissues gradually become saturated with dissolved gases. And after that, you can't just open the door, swim to the surface, and head home. Come up too quickly, and you can develop decompression sickness. Gas bubbles can form inside your blood and tissues. So after spending a long time under pressure, a person may need slow, carefully controlled decompression. Hours. Sometimes much longer depending on the dive profile. So imagine this. You live in an underwater city. Someone calls from the surface and says, "You need to get up here right now." And you're like, "No problem. See you in 3 days." But even that didn't stop us. Off the coast of Florida sits Aquarius, a full underwater research laboratory about 62 feet below the surface. Scientists can live there for days or weeks at a time, and NASA used Aquarius for its NEMO missions as an analog for living in space. And when you think about it, that makes perfect sense. You're surrounded by an environment where the human body cannot simply exist. You're isolated. You depend on equipment. Space is limited. And if something goes wrong, you can't just casually step outside. An underwater habitat turned out to be so similar to a space station that astronauts trained on the seafloor for future missions. But there's one detail that completely changes the picture. Aquarius is not independent. At the surface is a dedicated life support buoy. It contains generators, air compressors, communication systems. Power and air are sent down to the habitat, so one of the world's most advanced underwater laboratories is basically attached to the surface by a giant invisible umbilical cord. Now scale that up to a city of 50,000 people. You need oxygen, carbon dioxide removal, electricity, fresh water, wastewater treatment, food, communication, humidity control, medical care, constant maintenance, backup systems, and backup systems for the backup systems. On land, the power goes out and you look for a flashlight. Underwater, the power goes out, and your entire city suddenly remembers that it was built in a place where human beings are not supposed to live. And that is the biggest weakness of the entire idea. An underwater city doesn't free humanity from the environment. It makes us completely dependent on machines. Every breath becomes an engineering service. But fine, let's say we solve that too. We build multiple power stations, run heavy-duty cables, install battery banks, create emergency systems. Now we hit the next question. What are we going to eat? Because those beautiful underwater farms in science fiction have one small problem. Plants need light. The deeper you go, the less sunlight reaches you. At serious depth, a normal farm turns into an unbelievably expensive basement. Sure, you could use hydroponics, LED grow lights, algae, aquaculture. You could produce at least some food inside the city. But once again, everything comes back to one thing: energy. In fact, energy, not pressure, may be the true king of an underwater civilization, because with enough cheap, reliable power you can scrub the air, desalinate water, light indoor farms, run pumps, maintain communications, deploy robots to repair the outside of the city. Without that energy, your futuristic metropolis quickly becomes the most expensive sunken object in human history, which means a real underwater city probably wouldn't sit in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and it definitely wouldn't be at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. It would make far more sense to build it at a moderate depth, relatively close to shore, connect it to the surface with high-capacity cables, use multiple independent energy sources, keep transportation and emergency infrastructure nearby. So basically, we escape civilization by building an even more complicated civilization underwater. Perfect plan. But here's what's genuinely strange. Despite all of these problems, people keep coming back to the idea, and some are already trying to take the next step. In 2023, NOAA signed an agreement with Proteus Ocean Group involving Proteus, a large underwater research habitat associated with Fabien Cousteau, the grandson of Jacques Cousteau. The idea is to create something much larger than a tiny metal can for two people, a habitat where a team could live and work underwater for extended periods of time. A British company called Deep is pushing the idea even further. Its Sentinel system is designed as a modular underwater habitat for long-duration human missions. The company has described operations at depths of up to about 650 feet, with stays lasting as long as 28 days. And this is where things get really interesting, because this is no longer the experiment. Let's see if a human can survive underwater for a week. It's a different question. How do we make long-term human presence underwater a normal job? And apparently the human body may adapt to underwater living better than most people expect. In 2023, Professor Joseph Deturi spent 100 days living in an underwater habitat in Florida. At the time, it was a world record. 100 days. He slept, worked, conducted research, talked to people, lived a mostly normal life, with thousands of tons of water above his head. After the mission, there were reports of changes in different health markers, from sleep to cholesterol. But it's important not to turn one experiment into magical proof that living underwater makes people healthier. It doesn't. One person is not a medical revolution, but the long-duration stay itself was real. And maybe the first true underwater city won't appear because humanity finally conquered the ocean. Maybe it will appear because one day, we begin retreating from the surface. And then only one question remains. Would you move down there, knowing that between your bed and the entire ocean, there is only one wall?